Welcome to this year's first presentation for preparing future faculty. Our topic, as it says up here, is collaborations, working with others to increase your research productivity. Before I introduce our speakers, however, let me just remind you of a couple of things. First, of our second event, which will be balancing work-family responsibilities, something I'm sure all of you are struggling with even as graduate students, and we will have not only a faculty member who has specialized in research on the area, but also a panel discussion of some faculty who have had to do this in their own lives. So that's one thing. Another thing, there is an attendance sheet coming around. Be sure to sign it, especially if you are thinking about completing the PFF certificate. You don't have to get a signature for PFF events as long as your name is on that sheet. I can go back and check, so you're good. All right, with that, again, help yourself to refreshments, but with that, I would like to at least introduce our speakers. Here are our participants for the event. Jennifer Alonso, who's Assistant Professor in Communications and Theater Arts, will talk about building communication in research collaborations. Stacy Ringlab, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering, will talk about finding collaborators and how to work with them effectively or efficiently. And finally, Roger Harvey, who has stepped in for Larry Atkinson, who was called out of town. Dr. Harvey is the professor and chair of Ocean, Earth, and Atmospheric Sciences, and he will talk about the role of trust in interdisciplinary research projects. So with that, I will turn the podium over to Jennifer Alonso for the first presentation.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor. Thank you, Dr. Justice. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I do, and then we're going to do something, and then I'm going to fall down, and then and then I have a little prepared talk for you all. But so my professional background is theater arts. So that means that I went to school to be an actor and eventually to be a director, and that all of my background in academia was really in the practice of doing something. And so in the theater, when we have a conference, we all go and do something together. So we really think of our field as something that requires collaborators. So even a one-person show still has a lighting designer, a set designer, a director, and a bunch of technicians who are not the person on stage. So in fact, you really can't do theater without having collaborators. And so Holly Gaff was in the biology department, came to me about, oh my gosh, can it be 4 years ago, and said to me, you know, I am working on these interdisciplinary projects with the National Science Foundation in which biologists and mathematician faculty members are collaborating with their students on research projects. And we just had our annual meeting, and we are concerned because we are not collaborating together in the way that we really envisioned, and we're just not sure what to do. And I said, you know what, that is such an interesting problem to me. And so I began to think about how can we take what we do in theater and apply it to other professions. And in fact, I had to start thinking about, okay, what do we do in theater that creates collaborative groups who, when they're most effective in terms of actors, get together on day one and know nobody, and 6 weeks later are putting on a show that goes up at 8 o'clock, comes down at 10 o'clock, and everyone does their part. So how do we do that? So I began to really think about, okay, what are the things that we put in place so that our students are ready to collaborate in that way when they graduate? And then how can I make those things effective for people who are collaborating in this science discipline? So my research right now, and my main research right now, is working with people in the STEM disciplines to form really strong collaborations using the tools of theater. So any questions about that? Blah, 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 blah. I just talked a lot. All right, so here's what we're going to do. Please stand up. And meet the person next to you. So just say hello and find out who's next to you. I think I've met you before. Oh dear. No. My My father is a minister, so. All right, so let's come back together. Oh, no, don't sit down, don't sit down, don't sit down. All right, with that person that you just met, with your bodies, I want you to make a picture of what group work looks like. So when your teacher says, your professor says, we're going to do a group project, make a picture with your collaborator of what that looks like when you hear that word group project. So for instance, so just take a minute, make a picture. What do you feel when you hear those words group project?
Yes.
A lot of the undergrads don't. So you find them helpful. You know.
Hold on. Let's all come back together. Let's come back together. If I can get your attention. So you're telling each other what it means to do a group project, but I want you to show me what it means to do a group project. So with your person, see if you can make a sculpture with your bodies that shows what group project means to you. How do you feel when you hear those words, group project?
You can feel like you're reaching out to somebody. That's why I did that. Okay. Or you can feel like I'm turning my back on you, like some group projects do,
Number one. All right. Very nice. All right, I'm going to draw our attention to a couple of the sculptures. Can we see your sculpture? What does everyone see? What are they telling us with their sculpture of what group project looks like?
They don't quite trust each other yet.
Not quite. Okay, so there's a sort of pushing back and an almost coming together. Does that fit with what you guys were thinking about? How about this one back here? Can we see yours, your group project? Yeah. Someone tell me what that is. What do we see there? Oh, can you do it one more time just so we can see it? What does that say to us there? We saw some connections, absolutely. What else? Communication. Was there an aspect of togetherness? Yes. Was there an aspect of one person having to be pulled along, or did I? It's because of the chairs. Okay, so connection, collaboration. I totally understand. That's why I checked. Would anyone else like to share their sculpture? All right, go ahead and sit down. Thank you for playing. And now with words, what does it mean? How do you feel when you're informed you're about to do a group project? Any thoughts? So we had some not quite trusting each other, but almost trusting each other. We had a really nice sense of this group really felt like, okay, it's togetherness, it's coming together. Other thoughts about that? What does that mean? Yeah.
Sometimes I feel concerned about the other team players. If they are team players or not.
This is so great. Okay, so sometimes there's some concern because you don't know that everyone else is also a team player, right? So, and what do people who are not team players do? What do they do?
Free ride.
Depend on the others. They get a free ride. What else?
They do solo projects.
They do solo projects. Okay, and I want to show these two ends of the spectrum of a sort of poor collaborator, right? They give a poor collaborator, they're along for the ride. They don't do anything. And also, they do the other end of the spectrum, they do a solo project, right? So I'm the smartest. I'll just take care of it. You all don't even need to worry because I want to make sure I get my A. Yeah. Other poor collaborators. Other examples of poor collaborators.
People that don't get their work done on time.
People that don't get their work done on time, okay? So we might have a really excellent collaborator. They do excellent work, but they don't finish it in time, right? So if you have a grant deadline and you don't get those 2 paragraphs, it doesn't matter how great they were, didn't get them on time. What else? Yeah. Always talking about how busy they are. Yeah. So, I'm overwhelmed. I can't get to it. I'm so busy. I have this, and this. So, this is like the overcommitted collaborator, which I'm going to talk about in just a second in relation to my collaboration. So they've taken on too many things, and they can't please everyone, and then they're kind of upset because everyone's mad at them, right? Even though they're working really hard. Yeah. Other examples. The poor collaborator. Yeah.
The one who's not open to feedback and they're bossy and just think they're right.
Okay, so not open to feedback. They're bossy. They think they're right. So they put forth a paragraph to everyone. Everyone comments on it, and then they say, well, you guys are just wrong. Yeah. Anyone else? Any other poor collaborators? Yeah.
I'll go with the project manager who sort of nominates himself to oversee the work that everyone else does,
Okay.
but contributes very little.
Okay, so we have the project manager who's maybe not contributing, but really likes that management aspect and hasn't really checked with the group to see if that's okay to take that over. Yeah. There was another hand. Yeah.
Some members of the group, they work well, but they complain all the time, so they don't have tension.
Yes, the complainers, the tension creators. This never happens in theater because we don't have this type of people. The drama makers. Anyone else? Yeah.
The people who just aren't actually prepared. I mean, they're not capable of doing the work.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So you get a collaborator, and they're really assigned to you usually at this point, right? And they're not actually prepared to do the work. So they might be very smart. They might be on time. They might be really intelligent, nice, do all the right stuff, but they don't have the expertise that you needed. Any others? All right. Well, give yourselves a hand. We like to clap in the theater. I want to talk to you. I have some printouts, and I'm not sure I brought enough, so maybe we can share. But I'm going to talk to you about the process that I created to help people collaborate better. And part of that process is really thinking about, okay, we know what the aspects of the bad collaborator are, and we know sometimes that we are even guilty of those aspects, right? But we maybe don't know how to stop ourselves. And I'm going to give my example. I'm here today as a result of a collaboration with Dr. Justice, and I agreed to do this program, and then she emailed me like 5 times asking for a title, and I kept saying, oh, I'll get to that in a minute. I don't have time to think about that, and then I would forget, right? So she did an excellent, so my apologies, first of all, but she had an excellent strategy, which was, she looked at my paragraph, and she said, you know what? Here's a title I think would work. Would that be okay? So she did a really good job of alerting me to oh, I hadn't fulfilled my end of the bargain. And also, here was a possibility. So part of what I want to talk about today is how do we negotiate within collaborations. Every collaboration is going to, and every collaborator is going to have some weaknesses. And so how can we communicate and negotiate through those? Our instinct, I'm finding from the groups I work with, is to avoid the topic, right? So this person is always like, I'm really mad. I feel uncomfortable because I'm mad, so I am just not even going to talk about it, right? Has that ever happened to anyone? Right? So what I am advocating is that what can help us through these conflicts in collaboration is to communicate more rather than less. So the process that we are working with begins with really building rapport. So really thinking about how am I going to get my group to get to know each other? How am I going to get them to work together? And that has to happen not just at the beginning of a collaboration, but all the way through the collaboration. So what the research really shows us in terms of team building is that the people who socialize together are also the people who work well together. And this can work against a collaboration as well, right? So if everybody in the group drinks alcohol and everybody in the group goes out after classes for drinks, but one person in the group does not drink alcohol and does not go out for drinks for whatever reason, and that work continues, that person can begin to feel excluded. So when you're thinking about your collaborations, how can you make sure that rapport building is happening, and also make sure that the social group isn't excluding anyone, right? Because we all know that work maybe continues to happen over coffee in the morning or beer at night, and we want to make sure that we are including everyone who needs to be included in those conversations. Any questions about what I've talked about so far? The second thing that we look at is values. And I really ask my groups to talk openly about values. And we do an exercise that helps people kind of define and explore them in the moment. And we all have personal values which affect the way we act professionally. I have a 3-year-old son. I like to be home at dinner time. Okay, and so that's really my number one personal value right now is that I have time with my family, and I've set aside that dinner time hour. And so in my collaborations, I have to be really clear. I am not available from 4 to 7 in the evening. I'm just not. Even though we often do theater things during that time, I am not available during that time. And it has to do with a personal value. And I found I really have to be open about it, right? I can't hide that that is really important to me. And then we also have disciplinary values. So like I said at the beginning, my discipline really gets up, really values getting up and moving around and connecting with people and making really sometimes very physical contact, that we are interested in how people move and in what people's voices sound like. We're very interested in emotion. When I work with engineers, some of those things are not very interesting to them. They would rather avoid them. And so, not Stacy, but other engineers. So sometimes those things come into conflict because, for example, I might feel like I'm not getting anywhere because I'm not able to communicate in the emotional way that I'm used to. So I have to balance that. Disciplinary values also come into into conflict. So for me, when I'm collaborating with scientists and engineers and mathematicians, I don't have to publish. I have to produce a lot of shows, and I have to do a lot of theater, but I don't actually publish papers. And so our values could come into conflict when the mathematician is really thinking about, can I get a paper out, and I don't care, right? So I have to really understand that her discipline really values papers. And even though mine doesn't, I need to give some attention to what her discipline values. And we have to, again, talk openly about those things. Like, why are we doing this? What is important? My important might be different than Roger's importance, but we both need to respect what's important for each other. And we need to talk about it ahead of time. So, new collaborator, I'm really glad to meet you. Why do you want to do this project? I also, and this is what we spend most of our workshop on, and what most of these paragraphs are about, is dealing with conflict and not avoiding it, but really discussing ahead of time, how are we going to deal with conflict? How are we going, and setting up a structure. How are we going to speak to each other when a conflict comes up? So I've had one group where everyone agreed that it was okay to say, your work stinks. This is no good. They just all agreed that it was okay to say that in just that way, and they all agreed ahead of time that it wasn't personal, and that that was how they would communicate about that, because that was the easiest, most efficient thing to do. How many people in here would be comfortable with a collaborator saying, your work stinks, it's no good? Right, so this is a pretty unique group. And so what I recommend when you begin your collaborations is to begin to ask, okay, how are we going to address these difficult places of conversation? Lateness, failure to show up, work not done on time, all of those things we identified in terms of what the bad collaborator does. And we all sometimes are that bad collaborator. So if we can agree ahead of time about how we're going to talk about it and at least have a structure. Elaine, it seems like you're late to a lot of meetings. Is there anything the group can do to help you arrive on time, for example? Right? So one of our groups took that as their way of beginning a conversation, and Elaine would say, well, thank you for telling me. And then we have begun the conversation, which is the hardest part. With the groups I work with, we actually rehearse our difficult conversations. So everyone has to pretend to say the thing that might come up. They sort of see in their values that there might be some conflict that comes up, and they pretend to talk about it. And the usefulness of this, although it is of course very awkward, is that people are able to connect. So when it comes time for the performance, the real time when you have to talk to your collaborator about being late all the time, you've already done it once. You've had a rehearsal. It's not as scary because you know how to do it. You've rehearsed. I think I am. All right. So these are techniques to think about and things to think about as you begin to construct your collaborations. And I think that we, as human beings, are unbelievably optimistic. We really, really want everything to go well, and we really want, even if we see some red flags, that collaborator to be exactly what we have in mind, right? We really want this collaboration to work, and the project's so exciting. And even if that first kind of paper is, that first email is really late, we think, it was just that time. So also look for those red flags. And if there are things you just can't live with in a collaborator, it's okay to say, you know what, I'm not going to collaborate with this person. Because if you think about the time that you waste in terms of personal anxiety and dealing with a difficult collaboration. Think of, if you could put all that time into your next research proposal or another project in which working with your collaborator is easier, that's going to help you. So, all right. And some concrete things to agree on ahead of time. What are our objectives? What are we trying to do? These might be different for each collaborator, but you at least need to know what your collaborator wants out of the project, professionally, personally, and then for the actual project. So make sure that you know and can agree on them. How will we know we have accomplished our objectives? Okay, so how are you going to evaluate that you're on your timeline, that your objectives for each meeting have been met, and that you are, and once you have finished the project, that you've actually accomplished what you set out to do, and hopefully more. Timeline, I just talked about that, so make sure you agree on timeline and that it's realistic, okay? So again, for me, in 6 weeks out of the fall and 6 weeks out of the summer, I'm in production, which means I have rehearsal 4 hours a night, and I'm doing other things for my theater, and so I can't give time during that time. So I really have to look at grant schedules and say, oh, you know what, that's in October. It's not possible for me to work then. And how will we evaluate our work, both the work itself, but also our work in building the collaboration? And then how can we talk about best practices for the future? So where are we going to move on? Okay. And finally, it's really, really important to agree before you even start that grant, who's getting what money. Talk about money first, right? Just like getting married. Who's going to do what? Who is responsible for what? And talk about publication order and those things, and who publishes, right? So does everyone have the right to the data and they can publish whatever they want without checking with the other people? What are the rules for publication? And I think if you have any questions, I can answer them now. I've just talked an awful lot, which I'm not used to.
Totally, you know that.
Yes, it's totally true. Totally not true.
Have any questions?
Well, yeah.
I have a question related to working virtually.
Uh-huh.
How do you work
Excuse
with
me.
teams?
Just-
Maybe
sorry.
someone else is going to speak on it, but
Can you repeat?
Yep. My question is, how do you work with teams virtually?
Mm-hmm.
Like, how do you work with a team member who isn't physically located here? Particularly for us as doctoral students, sometimes we have classes with people who aren't even here.
Right.
So how do you virtually work with those people efficiently and effectively?
That is a really great question, and I wonder, is that part of what you're going to talk about?
It wasn't particularly, but the answer is easy. You just act like they're there. Effectively, you have to treat people as if, whether they're there or not, you have to basically try to find ways to make sure that you're as inclusive as possible, so that they don't have issues, because the communication is difficult enough. Jennifer has spoken about this already, and you will, and I'll talk more about science side, but it's you've got to have this global perspective. The expertise could be anywhere in the globe. And so you'll be doing more and more of that. So you've got to learn to work with these people, whether they're in front of you or not.
I think there's another part just having to do with emails, which is tone is impossible with emails. So I think it's really important. You can't tell jokes unless you know someone really, really well. Like joking around in email is extremely dangerous because it's easy to take it as an insult. To really err on the side of being as communicative as you can be, as clear as you can be, and as polite as you can be. It's easier with Skype and that sort of thing, but in email, there's something about its form where tone is just we're really deaf to tone, and it's really easy to read poor spirit into an email. So does that help?
Yep.
Other questions?
Yes.
Wait,
Oh.
I kind of have a question that kind of relates to that gentleman's. My personal experience with virtual group assignments, particularly those that are set up by an instructor without much structure to them.
Mm-hmm.
For example, by such and such date, you need to get into groups and complete this. Well, when you're doing on the web, and it's kind of it's very, very hard to get into groups and kind of get this uniform plan to complete your work. So I think, I don't know if that was kind of what he was asking maybe, but what are your suggestions about that? Because everyone is on a different time zone. I've been in class with people in England, California, and it's like it doesn't work. You can't.
Right, Skyping doesn't
you really
work. Right, it
can't
has
act
to be
like you're
asynchronous.
there.
Right.
So it's do you have any suggestions for that?
A couple, and it goes back to this idea of the project manager, right? So we don't really love the self-selected project manager, but I would say in terms of getting into groups, being able to say, okay, what, and you know, if a couple people can take some, not bossy initiative, but if no one's taking initiative, to really say, okay, you know what, let's divide ourselves up by something that makes sense, especially if we're talking about in terms of time or in terms of skills, right? So we need someone for each team who wants to be a project manager. Does anyone want to manage the project? I'm skipping around because I've just been asked to work on this a little bit with with someone else. So these are like thoughts that I've just really been beginning to engage in terms of the virtual environment. But I think that you have to pay attention to the group and its structure first before you can even move on to the project. I think sometimes we do the project first and then we figure out that the structure is broken. And then if we can do it the other way around and say, okay, let's structure this first. So here's the structure I was thinking of. Would anyone like to join me in this structure? I work from, Monday through Friday from 5 to 11 on this project. Would that be, is there anyone else who can work during that time? And then maybe you're avoiding some of the timing issues. Does that help? Did you have a question?
Yeah.
Oh.
I was just going to add to what you said.
Oh, please.
So I do group projects in my engineering classes, or group homework assignments actually in my undergraduate engineering classes. And in addition to everybody having to complete the homework as a group, they all have a role. So there's somebody who's a coordinator. So you all have like an extra piece besides completing the homework assignment. So, and they alternate from assignment to assignment. So the coordinator is the person who is in charge of figuring out everybody's schedule and making it work. Then there's somebody who, makes the assignment neat. There's somebody who double checks all the work. And I'm forgetting one other role. But if you can assign roles that way, in addition to getting the project done, then everybody has to take on a little bit extra step, and they have to tell me who did what in each assignment. So if there are conflicts, I can help resolve them.
So assign parts to the project would be a good way to go.
Well, not really parts, but roles. So your role for this whole project is so you can still assign parts, but there's one person who is in charge of coordinating everything. There's one person who's in charge of proofreading it and making sure it's cohesive.
My question is related to something that happened to me last fall. I was in a class and we were doing a group project, and the problem was that everybody was trying to be very nice to each other, and I wasn't so satisfied of what's happening because it was affecting the outcome, and we ended up by me being the evil of the group, and I didn't like
Embrace
that.
it. Okay, yes,
and
embrace it.
we
Yeah.
will be graded about the project, so it was a big conflict. So.
And tell me, why were you were voted as evil because you?
Nobody said that, but
No.
I felt it.
You felt that
yeah,
way.
I felt that way.
And can you just tell me a little bit more why? Because you spoke up and no one else did, or?
Everybody was trying to appreciate the other, even if we can see some flaws in the work. And I was trying to be honest as much as I can, and you can see the facial expressions, and they smiled to each other, but not to me. And
I understand. Okay,
yeah,
so you felt really excluded because, of
yes.
course, right? We all want it to be done, and we're happy with it.
Yeah, we're amazing, and
yes,
it wasn't
amazing.
the truth. Yeah, so
right. Absolutely. I think this is where sort of going back to the beginning and saying, well, if we have objectives, especially when we're talking about student projects, and I think some of this might fall away from you as you begin to collaborate more professionally, but that we agree on standards beforehand. So if everyone else wants a C and you want an A, that tells you something. So if in terms of like the amount of work you'll have to do you need to be a project manager? Do you need to take on some of these other roles? So if you can think about that ahead of time and even switch groups, if you can identify that ahead of time in terms of objective. But also going back and saying, you know what, starting the conversation with, and thinking if you could open it up to everyone, and Stacy and Roger might have some ideas too, how about we all find one part that we think could be improved? So let's all find one part that could be improved, and then maybe we could switch, and then another person would improve it for us, right? So kind of making it a game. We do this in theater a lot. We make it a game. So maybe that would help. No guarantees, of course, but it would be a strategy. And another strategy might be, when we get to the point where people are not making eye contact and no one's communicating, to say, to ask, gosh, is there a way I could have said this better? Because I feel like I've pushed you away, and that's not my intention. I just really want to fix flaws, and just sort of get some feedback in terms of, well, I'll just say, like in a marriage, my husband the other day said, a better way to say that to me would be X, and then I would do what you want. But when you say it like that, I don't really want to do it, right? So you can create a way so it's, so it's easy to step up. That can be very helpful. So does that help? Yeah.
All right. We probably need to move to our next speaker, so please help me thank Dr. Alonso.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
So I want to start by giving you a little bit of background on myself so you can kind of understand the information that I'm going to be sharing with you. So I'm a mechanical engineer, but my research is in biomechanics. So I study bones and muscles and what happens when you're injured, trying to prevent injury, if you have a disease that affects the way you can move. That's kind of the stuff that I look at. So I have always required collaborations, especially from clinicians, to tell me what are things that make them scratch their heads and try to use engineering to solve some of those problems. So that's kind of where my background comes from. And up until I got to ODU, I was always working with a team that included orthopedic surgeons. So even though I worked in very different application areas within, that would be interesting to orthopedic surgeons. So as an undergrad, I did research in a outpatient orthopedic clinic, working with people with spinal cord injury. For my master's degree, I actually worked with people at a Shriners Hospital for Children, which is an orthopedic hospital for pediatrics, with kids that had cerebral palsy and incomplete spinal cord injury. Again, always was working with orthopedic surgeons on that area. For my PhD, I went and I worked with mechanical engineers, my advisor. I worked with people in a image processing group because I did a lot of MRI type stuff, and an orthopedic surgeon. So then I moved into foot and ankle, and that's really a big thing that I do now. And then I did a postdoctoral fellowship, and the lab that I worked in was in an orthopedic department. It was an orthopedic biomechanics lab. So again, I was working with orthopedic surgeons. I was also at a major medical center, so I worked with radiologists and engineers and just a wide variety of people. So the other thing that has kind of brought me to ODU, which I might be here if this wasn't the case, but my husband works for NASA. So our life, this kind of touches on the life, work, family balance. We met 1 month before I graduated from college, and we spent 9 years trying to live together. And so we met in Cleveland. I moved to Philadelphia for grad school. 6 months later, he moved here, and 9 years later, three of those years we were married, I finally got a job here. So that doesn't mean that I wouldn't have ended up at ODU or a similar institution, but I had kind of always envisioned that, I would always be working with orthopedic surgeons. And I get here, and the local medical school doesn't have a department of orthopedic surgeons, or orthopedics. We have a Naval Medical Center, and they do have orthopedics, And I have done some work with them, but they are just hard to work with because they deploy. So, I'm working with somebody and then he's gone for half a year. So what do? You find new types of clinical collaborators to kind of give you those ideas. So then I just kind of wanted to tell you how the steps that I've taken to find these different collaborators. So the first piece of advice that I have is when you are starting a faculty position, if you want to purchase a piece of equipment or you're looking at different types of equipment, ask the vendors, do you have any clients at the university I'm going to? I lucked out that my very first day at ODU, one of the vendors that I worked with happened to be on campus servicing some equipment for my first collaborator at ODU, who was in the athletic training program. So this vendor knew I was coming here, and all of us went out for dinner that night. So that was how my first collaboration was kind of initiated. And I had never thought about working with athletic trainers. It ended up being a great collaboration, and that person is no longer here, but I've continued to collaborate with other people in the program and the person that's been hired in his place. So just by mentioning, oh, I'm going to Old Dominion University, and them saying, oh, we have a system there, was a huge help. And then this person, I actually started at ODU at the Virginia Modeling Analysis and Simulation Center, so I didn't start in a tenure track position. I actually started as a soft money position, then moved to research faculty, and then got a tenure track position. So that collaborator then introduced me to somebody in mechanical engineering who was interested in biomechanics, and that person probably helped me get my current job, but also has been an awesome collaborator the whole time as well. So within my first month here, I had met, somebody that I have tons of publications with, grant funding with, and then he introduced me as well to another one of my main collaborators on campus. So talk to vendors, whether it be software, hardware, whatever. Even if you're not going to buy their product when you're exploring it, find out if they know people at the university you're going to. And that, you still might buy a system or whatever that's different than somebody has on campus, but it can introduce you to potential collaborators. So that's kind of my first off-the-wall suggestion for how to find collaborators. The other way that I have found collaborators is through the Institutional Review Board. I do human subjects research, and I have actually met another one of my main collaborators when I submitted a protocol for review, and this person came up to me afterwards and said, I think I can help you. And 4 years later, we're still working together. We have, some pretty major grant funding together just because of that. I also happen to be an alternate on the IRB, so I see people's protocols come through, and sometimes they're interesting to me, and I contact the person and say, hey, we might be able to work together. There's also IACUC, the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, so if you happen to do animal research. So while these committees are a huge time sink, if you find yourself at a place where you don't know where to collaborate, it's not a bad idea to try to at least kind of be an alternate or join the committee, because you might find people to collaborate with. And I can say that the person that I met on the IRB had been here for quite a while, and I was the first person she ended up collaborating with at ODU, and I ended up introducing her to additional people here that since then she's collaborated with. So so that's another good way to meet people. Another way that I've met people is, obviously I know that Biomechanics is closely related to physical therapy. So I've just you can look for people in other departments that might match with you. So I have found collaborators in the physical therapy department who are just obvious matches for me. So you can kind of look around and see who's there and who has research interests. But a lot of time it's just hard to find people. I mean, I would have never known to go and talk to Jennifer about group work. So just giving me some ideas for my classes. So, and one thing I'll tell you is that research shows that there are two things that prevent the two biggest things that prevent women from being successful in faculty positions are the ability to find collaborators and childcare. So childcare, you can filter through places and say, okay, you have childcare, you don't have childcare, or whatever, that you just kind of have to pick on location. But collaborators, I think, is more important. Well, I mean, if you can't care for your child, you can't do your work. But as far as at the institution, finding collaborators, you sometimes have to be really creative with that process. So just kind of think about that. And I will say that even though my personal situation brought me to ODU, and maybe if I didn't have it, I might be at a different place that had orthopedics. I look at a lot of the people who have done, had a similar career training path as I have. And some of them have ended up at Research One institutions, but most of them haven't. Even though, we've gone to great grad schools, I did my postdoc at the Mayo Clinic, so we've done all the right steps to put ourselves at, we are worthy of a Research One job. There aren't, you go where you can get a job. And I'll say that I know two people that I've worked with either in graduate school or as my postdoc who are at Research One places. One is in a kind of tenure track position, and one is at more of a research faculty position. And everybody else has ended up at places like ODU, places that don't, I have a friend who's an engineer who is not in an engineering department. So he struggles because he can't recruit students with the technical background that he needs, but he has clinical collaborators in his department, so that there's that balance. I know several people that are at places that have kind of the same, actually are a little bit more disadvantaged than I am, because they're at places in the middle of nowhere, like not the middle of nowhere, but that don't have medical schools. So in the West, like Montana State, Boise State. So whereas at least I can sometimes reach out to Portsmouth Naval, they end up at places that don't even have medical schools, which is something that can limit my research. So, but they're still able to be successful by adapting a little bit, and being more creative and finding their collaborators. So, any questions before I go on to the second part of?
I wanted to know if you could elaborate a little bit on what you said about being, as a woman, being hard to find collaborators. If you could elaborate on that, like, is there a few women in your field, or why is that difficult?
I'll be honest. I've done some research on why the university should put child care at a high level of importance for retaining faculty for another role that I serve. So I've done research on trying to find out what people have done on, the importance of child care in faculty success. And what I found was information saying that it's not just child care, it's also that women find it harder to find collaborators, potentially because they're less aggressive at going out and finding them. They might be at a disadvantage for, I could get the article for you. I don't remember all the details of it, but I think, women tend to be less aggressive than men in going out and meeting people and making collaborations happen. And you know, if they're not mentored properly, they might not get introduced to the right person. So yeah, I've read the article, but it was a while ago, so I can't talk too much to the details.
I was going to ask, so some people in the humanities, they don't have much need to interact with vendors, or they might not be sending much work through the IRB. And maybe this is something that you're going to speak about more, but and I don't know if there are like conferences in your field that you go to, but how do you see, or can you speak to the role that conferences can play in collaboration, or how people can take advantage of those opportunities too?
I've actually found external collaborators at conferences more than internal collaborators. But I guess I would say in the humanities, the first thing I would say is I think that you guys have to publish books. So I would go for the book publisher venue and say, okay, if you're trying to publish your dissertation, say, you know, do you know somebody at, you know, wherever you end up who's published with you? So that might be a way to find people in the humanities. But as far as conferences go, they are great, at least from my perspective, because first you kind of learn what people are doing, and you can also say, hey, I'm doing something that complements you. Do you think maybe we can work together? And it is a little bit harder to work with people who are not physically with you, but sometimes if you have a strength and they have a weakness and they're looking for it, you know, and there's a good fit, you can definitely make that work. And I've also had a situation where I have a student whose boyfriend happens to be at another university, and there was somebody at that university that I've known for years, but we've never collaborated. But that student spent a summer in that other person's lab just because she wanted to spend the summer with her boyfriend. So we kind of found a way that we could collaborate. So sometimes there are opportunities that present themselves that, you know, are just a matter of circumstance that work out well. But definitely conferences are great for meeting people, getting ideas, getting feedback on your work. But it is a good place to meet collaborators. And I personally like smaller conferences where you actually have a chance to meet people. And I'm not sure if your conferences are big or small, but the smaller ones I think are better. And also ones that really promote students seem to have friendlier faculty members at them. So people are more likely to stand around and talk and get acquainted and find areas in which they could collaborate.
Good afternoon. Do you think it's easier to collaborate with, well, let's say you're on a tenure track assistant professor. Now you're in a department. Is it easier to collaborate with other assistant professors who are on that track as opposed to collaborating with professors who have got their tenure? So now they don't have the same pressures of publishing, and you've got to publish if you need tenure.
That's a great question, and I really think it depends on the personality of the person. I've had good experiences and bad experiences with both. So I was going to talk about this later, but I can bring it up now. You really have to be careful about when you choose your collaborators. You might find somebody that has an area of expertise that is exactly what you need. Like, this is my weakness, and you can fill that weakness. And that person might take money from you, and then do nothing. And there's somebody that I've had this experience with that I have provided funding for this person for 4 years, and the return that I've gotten on that funding is very little. So, you know, obviously I've kind of decided, fine, I'm just not going to, even though I have a weakness that you can fill, it's not helping me for me to put you on a grant and then for you to not do your part. So, and that person happens to be a full professor, but I will also say that my closest collaborator is a full professor, a department chair, and is active. So, I mean, so that person is very busy, you know him. So he.
You have a heuristic that you follow to pick and choose.
Yeah, well, I mean, part of it is just meeting people, working with them for a little bit, and finding out what they're like. So yes, there are going to be full professors who are not going to be interested in doing work, but I work with 3 full professors in different departments, and they are phenomenal to work with. I also work with several assistant professors in there. I mean, assistant professors are potentially going to be more motivated because they have to publish. They think they're going to get grants. But I've also worked with assistant professors who are overcommitted, too busy, and can't do their part because they're just kind of all over the place, like what Jennifer was talking about. They just have too many things going on, and they can't commit to they're not doing a good job at any one of them. So you kind of have to, for some of it's just going to be learning. The person that I've mentioned that I've, provided funds for on numerous occasions always says, oh, yes, I can do this. I will do this. Comes to meetings, gives ideas, comes to the first couple meetings of a project and then disappears. So, some of it is a learning experience, just in interacting with people. But I don't think you should say, yes, be more likely to work with assistant professors. And full professors have the advantage of they have experience getting funding. So they might be able to help you get funding more than a fellow assistant professor would.
And when you say get funding, you mean writing grants, proposals, things like that? Okay.
Right.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Do you find that university culture makes a big difference? I don't know how much you know about other universities, but do you find that university culture makes a big difference in terms of being able to find collaborations? Like I guess depending on how big the university is, the culture may be a bit more hierarchical and people may be less likely to collaborate with each other. Do you find that makes a difference? Or
yes.
Do you know anything?
So the great thing about ODU is it's very collaborative. I mean, the person I mentioned that I haven't had success with is the exception and not the rule. And I think, so I did my postdoc at the Mayo Clinic, and that is a very collaborative place. You can go into any lab and start doing research. And one of my mentors there told me, you will never find a place like this. And I have found a place like that, and that's awesome. But just having been told you will never find a place like this, I think that, and that mentor did not spend his career there, so he's been at other places. I have a colleague here who interviewed at the University of Michigan, and he said it's really weird. They have all these labs that are very identical. And I happened to talk to, and this was in a specific department, so I don't say that I'm commenting on that university. But I ran into somebody that was there at a conference this summer, and he said, well, it's very smart for a department chair to do that because everybody has their lab, and if they don't get along, you just move their labs farther away from each other. You don't have to deal with people arguing over equipment. So I think that a lot of places are not that collaborative. And I think that it's important. I mean, Research One schools, and these are kind of gross generalizations, have tons of resources. So there are things that I wish that I had here. So I wish that I had a department of orthopedic surgeons to work with. I wish that there was a research MRI in the area so that I could keep doing the imaging work that I had done. But there are also trade-offs of, okay, I would be expected to get a lot more funds. I wouldn't be able to teach as much as I do, and I actually really like to teach. Publications need to be more and stuff like that. So there are definitely trade-offs, and I think advice that I was given at kind of different workshops and conferences that I went to as a graduate student was make sure you feel comfortable where you're going. If you don't get a good feel, even if you don't have another job offer, don't take it. And I do know somebody who had one tenure track faculty position, then went and did a postdoc, went and took another tenure track position, and that is now in his third tenure track position, and in a relatively short amount of time, in probably 9-10 years, because I think he finally has found the place that fit him well, but he took a job that he realized he shouldn't have, realized that if he didn't get extra research training, he probably wasn't going to get another faculty position, so he kind of went backwards and did a postdoc. Then the next job he did, it actually felt like a great fit, and then between his interview and when he started, his department chair quit, and a new chair came in, and the fit that he thought he felt was gone, and and now he's somewhere else. So I think it is really important to find a place that you feel has a good fit. And I can say you can really tell this in interviews. When you interact with people, you can tell. You can also tell, I haven't had this experience, but I've talked to other people. If you go to a place for an interview and you're there for less than a day, that kind of tells you that they're not really invested in you, and they're not trying to get you to feel comfortable about where they are. If you're interviewing for a faculty position, your interview should be at least a day, probably longer, and they should try to send you around with a realtor so you can get a feel for the area. Make sure you meet as many faculty members in the department as possible. And if you don't get that experience, you should feel uncomfortable about it. So, all right. Any other questions? All right. So the next part of my talk, which I've kind of already stepped into, is how to kind of make sure you're working well with your collaborators, and making sure that you pick who to work with well. So you already know I've had great experiences with some people, and I've had horrible experiences with, and I don't want to say horrible. I haven't had a horrible experience with anybody. I've had less than great experience with some people. And this is where I kind of wish I had my slides, because I don't completely remember all of the points that I had. But I think it's important so just to refresh your memory, at my time at ODU, I started on a soft money job, went to research faculty, which is sort of soft money. You are expected to support at least a portion of your salary, and now I'm in a tenure track job, which I'm still expected to bring in funds. But it's the amount of pressure you feel when you are in a soft money job and you have 1 year to generate enough funds to support your salary is very different than the pressure you feel for funding when you're in a tenure track job. Or even now some research faculty positions at any university, you're expected to support your whole salary. The job I was in, I was expected to support half. So my stress level went down over a 3-year period. So I basically spent a year in soft money, a year research faculty, and then got into the tenure track position. So there are a lot of things that I did in my soft money position because I needed money to support my salary. And anybody who's in a soft money job would do this, but it has actually carried over into even now, because there were some projects I had funded that were a little bit out of my area that I'm still working on. So try not to get, unless you really just want to do research and you are in a very highly fundable area, it is desirable to not be on soft money. I think everybody can agree to that. But again, I wanted to live with my husband, so that was my number one personal value priority. So I would have moved here without a job. But I've learned a lot from that experience. And what I've learned is that you really need to look critically at the people that you're working with, and also kind of the grants that you apply for. So a lot of the funding that I have carried over from this soft money experience is SBIR funding, which is a small business innovative research program. So there's money that Congress sets aside that you can get through NIH, NSF, and DoD. The Department of Defense ones are kind of the easiest ones to get, and there's, I think, more funding for them. And the way it works with the Department of Defense is they write topics, and 3 to 4 times a year they release all these topics, and small businesses look at them and say, I can do this, I can do this. You know, they pull whatever topics they can do. And while I was working in soft money, I was actually partnered with a small business that was a new business. They had just started up. I started writing grants with them in 2007, and they had started up in late 2006. So that should have been my first red flag. So the thing about these SBIRs is that they have a lot of development and very little academic payoff. And so this collaboration that I'm talking about is a collaboration with a company and not with other faculty members. But what I've learned from this, and I'm sure there are other mechanisms that are other opportunities that you might have in your time as, you know, your career, where funding might end up in no academic payoff. Now, funding does provide academic payoff because you get credit for research expenditures, you know, purchase release time, which, you know, buys you out of a class and gives your department some extra funds. So you do get some academic payoff, but the publications, which is really what is more satisfying to me, are really hard to get with these mechanisms. So I think one thing that you need to look at with your collaborators that can be, whether it be with small businesses or with other faculty members, is, am I going to get a publication, or am I going to get what I need out of this to further my career? So for me, it is publications. For somebody else, it might not be. Money and publications. So money, yes. Publications, really hard. So I've had this one SBIR that the phase 1 was funded right when I started my tenure track job, which was in 2008. We're just starting the second year of a no-cost extension. So we're now at the end of 2012, so 4 years later. And I've had some conference abstracts, but I have no publications for it. We're collecting data now, and we will get a publication out of it. But 4 years working on a project is a really long time to go without getting a publication on it. Now, I'm doing other things. I'm getting publications. That's fine. But when you look at the payoff on that, it's kind of like, what was I thinking? So I can imagine that this situation would not only happen with an SBIR, it could happen with certain consulting it can happen with, but it could also just happen with, you know, some collaboration. You could put a lot of effort into a project, and, you know, especially if you're developing something. So we've put a lot of effort into developing this product, which we are now able to collect data with. So there will be payoff from it. And the university might even get some royalties from it if they sell it. So that's another, you know, nice thing. But you really have to be careful in evaluating your collaborations to see, am I going to get what I need for my career, my self-satisfaction? Is it worth the time that I'm spending or the sleep that I'm going to be losing? Because I'm working on this project, but I also have to work on this project because I need to get, you know, keep publications moving out the door. So that's something you really need to evaluate. And the other thing, like I already said, is you need to look at your collaborators. I mean, you're not, you know, you can, sometimes senior faculty members will give you the heads up about certain people, like, yeah, don't work with that person, they never deliver. You might still choose to give that person a chance. But if somebody doesn't deliver once
even if you really, really, really want that piece of expertise, unless you're willing to have that uncomfortable conversation that Jennifer mentioned, to say, you know, the last project we worked on, I gave you, you know, I paid 50% of your summer salary, and I know you didn't put in however many hours that would have worked out to be, and I didn't get what I thought I was going to get from you. Why did that happen? You don't want to be all, you know, accusing. And can we make it work next time, or should I find somebody else to collaborate with? So unless you're willing to have that conversation, do not let that, you know, continue to collaborate with that person. Even if, you know, it will take you less time to strengthen yourself in that area, or even to find somebody outside of the university to collaborate with, then it will, and it's just frustrating to put somebody on a project and then have them not deliver. So those are kind of the pitfalls. And then the last thing that I'd like to say, and I probably need to stop talking, is to just be careful about your time commitments. So somebody might come to you and say, you know, can you do this? Does it fit with your research? Yes. But you know what? Realistically, I'm not going to be able to work on that for another year. You know, so, and I just recently had that happen. I had somebody come and say, you know, I'm interested in doing this, and he was honest with me. He said, I don't want you to tell me you're interested and then not be able to do the work. I'm tired of, he said, I'm tired of people telling me that. And I thought about it, and I said, yes, I'm interested in this. Yes, it is right along the lines of something I want to do, but with what I have going on right now, I'm probably not going to be able to work on it for a year. And you need to, you know, and you should be straightforward with people when you're collaborating with them, is do you have time to really commit to this project? And if the answer is no, that's fine. You might find some other time where it works. So, any other questions?
Thank you very much. Well, I know you may have questions, but I feel like we need to move on to the third presenter.
All right, so grab something and we'll carry on. Jennifer and Stacy have covered an awful lot of ground, and they've covered, frankly, about 90% of what I wanted to talk about. But and as you know, I'm standing in for Larry Atkinson, and he is older and wiser, as I get to kind of prod him every once in a while as one of our distinguished faculty. But within the university, oceanography, this is very easy for me to say, is we consider ourselves one of the most interdisciplinary programs on campus, because oceanography as a science, of course, is very interdisciplinary. And so we're constantly having to go back and forth about negotiating, if you will, what areas people are going to provide their expertise for, how we merge projects, and of course, the reality that every graduate student in here should realize is that research is not really supported by the university. The faculty generate income to support their research programs. So the university provides infrastructure, at least to a certain extent. They provide the rooms, they provide the electricity, they provide the lights. But in fact, the actual research that gets done, if you're in the hard sciences, and I don't say that to diminish the other sciences, just to kind of define them a little bit, in fact, is all supported by grants and contracts. And that's a kind of a hard reality some people don't realize. As a graduate student, I just assumed that when I walked into somebody's lab and all this stuff that was there, right? But in fact, it's not. So in fact, when we talk about interdisciplinary research, that becomes important because it tends to define people's perspective on what they want to get accomplished. When in fact, they may be the one to write the grant to support that piece of equipment. They're the ones to write that grant to support the graduate students or the technicians or the postdocs that have to do the work. Okay? So let's just push aside this assumption that when we say a research university, that means that suddenly resources are all there for research science. Because in fact, it doesn't change if you're a research university or not. In fact, the faculty are typically the ones that have to generate those resources. And so what that means is when we talk about trust, you have to talk about really, being kind of the old school guy, to me it's kind of simple. It's all the stuff we learned in elementary school, right? You've got to play well in the sandbox. You've got to learn to trust the other person to do the right thing, and that really starts with really two things if you want to talk about research kind of collaborations, and especially interdisciplinary ones. And these are really simple. The first one is the question that all your potential collaborators will have is that what are you bringing to the table? You have to bring a specific expertise that provides both value to the project and provides your contribution. Unless you want to be a professional coordinator or manager, and that's a different sort of skill set, then in fact the question you ask yourself and you ask those that you might collaborate with is well, what do I bring to this project? And of course the parallel to that is that if it's something that looks like it's maybe far afield from your expertise, your skill set, then you might have a tough time kind of weaseling your way into a program, or at least delivering the goods. So it could have a bad outcome later if in fact you're not prepared to provide that level of scientific expertise or the skill set that whatever project might be looking for. So you've got to bring something to the table. The second one is to be aware that your collaborators need to do the same thing. And there are everybody's had collaborators in the past and it gets back to what Stacy and Jennifer talked about, people that have said, oh, we can do that. Oh, yeah, we can take care of that. And they don't deliver sometimes. And so you get kind of in that uncomfortable position of, well, I've done my part, but they haven't. And you learn from those mistakes. Stacy gave a couple examples. We've all had, at least those of us who've been in various fields for a while, we've all learned that lesson. Starting out as sometimes a postdoc places, and then certainly in the faculty, there are people who will deliver, and then sometimes there are people that don't. And so that's meaning you really need to, this is a people problem. This is not a, here's my science and we're all going to do this in a very objective way. It's a people issue. And so the important thing about the idea of building trust is really it's the interaction of individual investigators and it's individual people. So you've got to get to know them. And that's real difficult in the sense that we had that question earlier about doing virtual interactions. That makes it even more imperative that you get to know the people that you're starting to look at to do interdisciplinary kinds of questions.
Roger, I just want to interject something since I think there are graduate students in here who may or may not want to ask this question. What about collaborations between graduate students and faculty? Because the graduate student is in kind of an awkward position in trying to negotiate some of these things.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I think it's one. Let me turn the question in just with a little wave of hands. How many graduate students work with other graduate students on projects, or does everybody have their own? A few, but a lot of people kind of have their own project, right? This is yours. This is the one you take home, and then you have your faculty mentor to kind of guide that. If the project, for example, is with other graduate students, and we often encourage this in oceanography especially, we have graduate students within our department that in fact, not only within, for example, my own research group, but with other graduate students that are doing other sorts of things, we have big problems and everybody brings something to the table, so they may work together. And that time, the important point is that the trust goes hand in hand with communication. Jennifer brought this up. Stacy mentioned this, and it sounds a little simple, but you've got to communicate back and forth with your current collaborators, your potential collaborators, so that everybody knows exactly what the expectations are. Jennifer talked about this, asking the hard questions early. Sometimes we don't do that very often because one of the hardest questions within the oceanographic discipline, and it gets back to this trust question, is what's it going to cost? Because, as I mentioned, and don't mean to sound jaded, but when you're in a research environment that in fact you're generating grants and contracts to support your research funding, sometimes a collaborator will look to you and ask, well, what's this guy going to cost me? And is that piece of information valuable enough so that I need that to get? And it's so that's a little bit of an undercurrent, and this is why the trust issue becomes kind of critical. You try to work with the best people you can, but there's often something I always I tell all my graduate students, and I'm not going to ask them to flip the camera off, and I'll tell you, but the secret is, and it gets back to this trust issue: don't work with jerks. All right? The person could be the best global authority on a particular idea, but if they're a prima donna, it's not going to help you. It's not going to help your project. It's not going to get anything done, and their level of expertise won't be applied in the kind of way the project may require, because there are very few areas of expertise out there that there's only one person that can do it, or not one person that has the skill set. There are a lot of great people out there, and the hard part is actually doing that sorting process as you kind of work through. So the idea of trust in interdisciplinary projects, part of it is delivering your own skill set to the project. Part of it is being able to decipher somebody else to be able to bring it, and so that's where networking becomes incredibly important. We talked about, from Stacy, about conferences. We talked about lots of opportunities for people to interact. You can Facebook every other friend you know and find out what's going on. But you've got to gather this information, because if someone has been in the sciences or the humanities or the engineering programs, they're publishing, they've developed a reputation. Well, they have a whole network of colleagues, and which means they have graduate students perhaps. They have people they work with. And it's not hard to have conversations either with them or with other people to find out if they're a good guy or not. And if you're like me and you've been around a while, you've learned to do this. And so, in fact, if I'm going to develop an interdisciplinary research program, and at the moment, for example, we've got I didn't give much of my background because you guys don't care, but I'm an organic geochemist. I work mostly in the Arctic. I have for about the last 15 or 20 years. But at the moment, we're just completing a project in the Bering Sea. I'm one of 93 PIs on this giant 5-year program, right? And so I got tapped to help do some of the coordination for that. I didn't volunteer. I just got asked to do that. And part of the idea that when we went out and started talking about this was, well, who can deliver and who cannot? And when we identified gaps in this large program, because there are always scientific questions that you miss when you just solicit proposals to ask a broad question, you get proposals that come in, and one of the metrics that everybody looks at, well, can this person deliver? Or are they just going to take the money and run? And so you start asking. You start going out in the community saying, well, is this person okay? Can they kind of do the job? And they can base it on their publications, and you can base it on their expertise. But at the end of the day, you base it on whether they're a reasonable person and can do what you need. So if you take nothing else, you can write that note down. Don't work with jerks, and go from there. And it sounds kind of simple, but that's the way it is. So questions of trust. I mean, I'm kind of curious from this group. Have people run into those kind of problems already, or is this just like a hypothetical? Be careful. Nobody wants to volunteer? Give me the sign. Yes.
I see a brave person back here.
I did have just kind of a general question in regards to when you do this kind of background investigation on the people you're going to collaborate with. Because professionally, I've done a lot of research collaboration and have found myself in the company I work for collaborating with jerks. But then you've gotten yourself into a situation where you kind of can't cut the dead weight. But how do you go about asking that information in such a way that you remain professional and not, are these just verbal conversations you're having in regards to people's deliverability?
Yeah. Let me not take you down the path of this is like a CSI investigation that we're going to say, you got to really check the backgrounds of every person you work with. This is mostly kind of a professional discussion about what work do they do, what do they contribute to other projects. Within the oceanography discipline and marine science in general, There are in fact probably over half of the projects that get done, and those are funded by typical federal agencies, largely things like NSF. More and more we find that they're not sole investigator projects, they're multi-investigator projects. And that's the trend that will continue. These days, NSF has gone from, in the old days, about 2/3 or even 3/4 of programs were funded, and then I'm speaking from the science side, mostly geosciences, about 2/3 were funded to individual PIs, and now that's less than half. And so the argument that the questions have gotten more complex, the ability to pull together different sorts of disciplines have gotten more important. And for example, 10 years ago when we thought about proteins, we would never think that we would need bioinformatics and genomics and all these kinds of questions to ask, whether it's a medical issue or an environmental chemistry question about how the ocean works. And so we're pulling people lots of different expertise in. And sometimes you don't even know the discipline at all. So it becomes imperative to start from a kind of very professional point of view, just asking, seeing if those people participate in society kinds of issues. That often means that they're willing to contribute back to the community. But my real point is not to do a big sorting process, is to avoid the assumption that the person with the greatest number of publications and the greatest amount of funding is the ideal person to work with. I like the idea, and I certainly kind of approve the idea in principle of working with the best and brightest you can find. But those are often the busiest people you can find as well. And there are a lot of very good people who may not have the 20,000 publications, but they may be on campus here, they may be nearby, they may have lots of skill sets, they may be the assistant professor that was a postdoc in this group from Mayo Clinic or somewhere else that suddenly has their own research program who's interested. And you just got to do a little bit of homework. And that's just a kind of a general point. And I found that to be really helpful, especially when we're going into fields that we don't really know. I mean, if I'm talking about marine chemistry, I can pull up a list of all the people who I think are great collaborators and you can work with and who contribute. But if I'm talking about bioinformatics, where we're doing protein kind of work, I don't know anybody. And so I have to start reaching through the network to try to find people who are, one, interested, because they have to care, of course, and secondly, who are willing to kind of reach out and do these interdisciplinary research projects. Because sometimes it's kind of hard to pull people over the line and say, you know what, you really should care about this. I mean, I'm a personal example, and I won't delve into this too much, but if you're a marine chemist, one of the big issues for us has always been proteins in the ocean. It's a lot. It's a big pool of stuff. You know, one cell makes 10,000 kinds. We haven't known a whole lot. But if you're in the biomedical field, well, every guy that works on cancer is looking at protein distributions because they're looking at targeting that one cell that makes a different kind of protein that's going to be cancer cell. Huge amounts of expertise. Well, we said, well, we need to get some of that expertise into the oceanographic realm to start looking at what all these cells are responding to climate and all sorts of other issues. And all the expertise is in the medical field, where they have tons of money, giant, wonderful instruments, and lots of information. And so I start looking around for people who might have some kind of an oceanographic background, perhaps, but they do medicinal chemistry. And so I may go to a meeting that are mostly the biomedical field. And I'm the lone oceanographer kind of wandering through the masses, so to speak. And you go to posters, you go to these talks, and you start talking to people. Just as Stacy said, you go to these meetings and sometimes you talk to people. And, you know, the conversation with these guys usually starts about, what's your matrix? Are you working on urine? Are you working on blood? Are you working on mast cells? And I say, well, we work on mud. And they just go, oh, my God, what do you do? But, you know, you had that conversation a few times, and then somebody was intrigued. And they said, well, you know what? You know, matrix that we work with is really a problem. And I bet we're willing to bet if we can work in mud, we can work in anything else. And so that started off on a collaboration, and it's kind of continued over the last 5 years. And so we talk about, it's like talking about baseball. You don't talk about a lot of things, but you have a few things that you can talk about, and that information starts to go back and forth. And that often starts at the graduate students. You send them out in exchange. You start to work your way up for that. So you can do these sorts of things, but the hard part is sorting through people. Now for the graduate students, that process kind of starts when you start thinking about either a job or a postdoc. And the rules still kind of go. I mean, you want to try to work with the best people you can find in the area that you think that'll expand your career. And I'm one of the people that I'm kind of at the point of my career, I'm happy to say I'm kind of a mongrel. I mean, my training is, biology, chemistry, microbiology, and organic, molecular analysis. So it's kind of rampant. It's kind of gone up and down over the career span. But these days, the skill sets that are required typically are pretty broad, with the caveat that you've got to bring something to the table in terms of what you have for a project, which means don't dilute yourself out too much saying, I can do anything, because, well, then you're a technician. Yeah. You've got to, for a postdoc, you've got to think of what you can learn from wherever you're going to get a job, but at the same time, you've got to bring something to it as well. And that makes you more employable, and it expands your horizons. But Elena was going to make a comment.
I was just going to comment that lest people think that this multidisciplinary collaboration kind of emphasis is only in the sciences. Remember, we had somebody here from theater arts, and I can tell you that this kind of trend, especially from funding agencies, of wanting to see multiple disciplines represented, whether it be in the health sciences or arts and letters or wherever it might be, I think is one that's going to continue over time, which is really kind of the basis or the for this event for graduate students.
Yeah. And one thing you may not know, hopefully you do, is across the university, Old Dominion has a climate initiative. We're 2 feet above sea level, right? This is probably the best place around to look at changing sea level and climate. And Jennifer's part of that initiative. In fact, she has an interdisciplinary project with several of our faculty in oceanography to develop theater kinds of approaches for informing youngsters about climate change. And that's reliant on Fred Dobbs, a professor in our department, along with Victoria Hill, and they gotten together with her to develop a play that's been actually shown around campus a few places and over in the theater. They provide the validation of the hard science behind it. She provides, as you can well see this from today, the enthusiasm and the drama, and very interdisciplinary, very collaborative, as you might guess, and it's been very successful. And so this climate initiative is doing that same sort of thing across multiple disciplines, from finance to business to science. And Larry Atkinson, who was going to speak here, he's the one that's really been tasked by President Broderick to help push that initiative along. And he's been the one that's been trying to reach out. And what they do is what you often do is they start with a lunch or something, and they talk about, what are the commonalities between the disciplines or the arts or business that somebody can bring to the table.
Any questions?
So questions?
Either for Dr. Harvey or, since Dr. Ringlev is still here, for her.
And you can ask me Jennifer questions. I can only kind of wave and things, but we could go from there.
Anything?
Sure.
I have a question. You mentioned, this person who you worked with who didn't deliver, and and you're dealing with the trust. If you do end up saddled with somebody that's part of your grant proposal, and you're doing whatever 2 or 3 year deal, and they're not living up, and you've gone to them and said, look, you're late, you don't have the work, your quality isn't where it should be, whatever. Can you fire somebody? Can you say, look, you're not doing it, we don't want you here anymore? When you get a grant, are you stuck with them for 3 years? And then how do you go about rebuilding that trust? Because you may be seen as like the hard one who's like, hard to work with, because this person's obviously going to go out with bad feelings towards your group professionally and be like, don't work with them, they're hard, you know what I mean?
No, that's a very good question. And it's funny because when we talk about writing grant proposals, especially these collaborative ones, there's not necessarily a coordinator, but we like to refer to it, there has to be a hero. There has to be somebody that pulls together the suite of PIs, whether it's 2, 3, 4, 5, sometimes can be a big one with 8 or 10 investigators associated with big projects, and does that hard work up front of, one, making sure that everybody is well aware of exactly what their expectations are. What are you going to bring to this project? And they provide kind of the oversight is maybe too strong a word, but they basically push the proposal through to make sure everything gets in and everything is done properly. If you're fortunate enough to get those funded, oftentimes that lead investigator is tasked with doing just what you said, of kind of making sure everybody holds up their end of the bargain. And I think Jennifer had a very good suggestion when she spoke, and that is talk about that before the grant ever goes in. That doesn't happen. In fact, in 20 years, I can't remember that ever happening on a proposal that we talked about. Well, what happens if you don't come through? Because the expectation is everybody's going to come through. And the expectation that if you've had those discussions and you identified those PIs up front, and everybody's done a good job of communicating, then in fact that'll be minimized. But frankly, it happens. And I think in some respects, if you think of that, it's not like you're going to have one grant in your career. You'll have hopefully multiple grants in your career. Then we often just assign it to a lesson learned and say, okay, if this person goes over into this other box that, well, okay, they're nice people, but I'm never going to work with this person again. And we learn that lesson. And there are people. I have a little box, and there are a few people in it that you just say, I like what they do. They do good work, but in my case, on one project, and I only give them one chance. I'm not as nice as Stacy. They never get a second chance, but they didn't come through. And so therefore, if I can't rely on them, and they're critical, and that information is a critical part of that project, then we're all going to suffer for it. And so you just say, there's lots of other good people around, and you find somebody else. Now, as far as coming up with consequences if people don't deliver, well, that's something, in my case, for example, that's something the funding agencies kind of keep track on, because the publications are what are the end product of much of the work that gets done. And so when they see the publications are associated with the project and this important gap of, say, some physical oceanographic analysis wasn't done, well, people figure it out. It may not be a very quick process, but over time it actually works. And so those people the funding gets harder. People kind of politely step back and go, well, yeah, I'm just so busy I can't work with you on this. So that's why it gets back to don't be a jerk and don't work with them, because you don't need Facebook for that kind of information to get around eventually. You just got to be a reasonable person and deliver what you promise.
Other questions?
Stacy can comment on that. She's got.
Stacy?
Yeah, I was actually lucky both times that this person that didn't come through for me. One, it was kind of not the stuff that I needed him for. I lost out on a publication. So he analyzed some data, but needed to go an extra step, and so I lost the opportunity for a publication and just took it as a loss. The second time, it kind of worked out so the reason why I gave this person a second chance is because one of my other collaborators said, you really need him. And so I said, okay, you're right. I think we really need him. Well, it turned out that as the project progressed, some more research came out. And the program director that was funding us said, you don't need this part. So I was actually kind of able to, even though he wasn't doing his part all along, I was kind of able to tell him, research has come out that we really don't need the piece that you need, and I really need the funding that I had set aside for you for my grad students, and I'll still list you as an investigator. You'll still get indirect costs from this project, but would you be willing to give up your salary to allow me to fund some more students to do the part that that really needs to get done, and he was okay with it. So.
But that doesn't always happen.
Yeah, that does not always happen. But yeah, I agree. I mean, now I'm at the point where I'm never going to work with that person again, and I think that's really the way it generally works out. If it doesn't work, and I think a lot of times you end up losing more things, like you put in time and you don't get that publication out of it, and so you know that person's not worth the time, I think, or the money.
As new and potentially new faculty, you also want to always make sure you're not the person they're talking about.
I was just going to comment on his comment about what you do when they're not working. I used to work on multidisciplinary grants before I went back to school, and we used to negotiate as well. We couldn't really fire them because there are PIs on the project, but we would negotiate of, like, do you want to give up part of your salary to hire somebody else, or can we reorder the publication output author so that somebody that's doing more on it. And sometimes if you give some of that and you ask those questions, you're not creating conflict and they're willing to work with you on it. But the other thing that we used to do is I used to be the project director or the project manager, and actually a lot of the conflict came through me, which helped our PIs because they then almost used me as their sounding board. But then I think having that mediator was able to talk to different PIs to get the perspective, to get the work done, and there wasn't conflict between them. So that's what I was going to.
Yeah, and that's a good point. I mean, most especially big federal programs, you'll have a program manager that is there to mostly just to kind of guide some of the science. They don't necessarily have to guide the budgets, but they can also be the ones that, if you want to kind of whine or you want to say this isn't getting done, you say, well, we're having a little tough time with Bob, and so this part's not really done. And some programs, depending on where they are, some programs the program managers are more interactive. Some of them will say just work it out, and if it doesn't work out, then we'll put the A on their forehead and keep that in mind for next time. But so it really varies tremendously, and I have no experience with the arts about in letters about how that might work. I can only tell you about the sciences. But across the sciences, I wouldn't say it comes down to being ostracized, but it does come back to that people know that either one, that you're brilliant but difficult to work with, or that all those sorts of things that Jennifer mentioned, they're super busy and they may be late. They may give you a piece of this. They may just send their graduate students to work on this. People that are in the field for a few years figure this out pretty quick because time moves pretty quick. And so people can't wait around. They need to know, especially for younger faculty that are working towards tenure, and they need those publications to show what new information they're providing. For even seasoned faculty that are supporting graduate students or whatever, they need to get those grants and continue to get those grants to make sure that their research programs continue. So people aren't as patient as they used to be in the old days. Other kinds of questions? Haven't been too much of a downer on a Friday afternoon, have I? But
thank you very much to all of our
thanks.
presenters.